Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the free society, a society based on limited government. In essence, the libertarian philosophy. I want to talk to you this week about my new book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. There's now been 8 reviews that have been placed on Amazon. All of them have been 5 stars. And one of the highest compliments, they were all complimentary, but one of the highest compliments that was paid to me was by one of the commenters that said that this now had become one of his favorite books, along with a book entitled JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Mattered by James W. Douglas. Now that one stuck out at me, that comment, because I happen to believe that Douglas's book is an absolute masterpiece in terms of understanding this assassination and why it's so important to what's going on in our lives today, why some of us continue devoting our attention to it. It's not just some historical tidbit that took place many years ago. It is actually a relevant part of our nation's history that bears a direct relationship to where we are as a country today and where we need to go to get back on the right track, away from the crisis, chaos-filled environment in which we live, and onto the road to liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world. So Douglas's book has been a long-time favorite of mine. I think it's the best book that's ever been published on the Kennedy assassination. I highly recommend it. So for the commenter to be including my book as now one of his favorites, along with Douglas's book, that came across as a big super compliment for me. Now, why did I write this book? How did it come into existence? Well, you all know that I've done a lot of work on the Kennedy assassination over the years. I've got 2 books called The Kennedy Autopsy and The Kennedy Autopsy 2. The first one has become our all-time bestseller at FFF. I've also written a book called Regime Change, the JFK Assassination, and then The Evil of the National Security State. We've got a book by Douglas Horne, who served on the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. That's called JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated. We've got 2 books by Jefferson Morley. We've had conferences, presentations, the videos of which are all online in the multimedia section of our website. Well, anyone who has done even a minimal amount of study of the Kennedy assassination is familiar with what has become known famously as the Zapruder film. So last summer, I happened to just, by happenstance, discover a book entitled 26 Seconds, A Personal History of the Zapruder Film. And it was written by a woman named Alexandra Zapruder, who is the granddaughter of Abraham Zapruder. So I thought, well, this would be kind of an interesting read, how the family dealt with this film, and so I'll take a look at it. Now, who was Abraham Zapruder? Well, he was a Dallas businessman. He was a Russian immigrant. He had come from New York when he was a child. He had come to New York as a child. He got involved in the garment business, and he later married a woman there in New York named Lillian Shapovnik. And they ended up moving from New York City to Dallas. And he ultimately founded a store, a women's dress store where they made women's dresses, that was right there near Dealey Plaza where the assassination took place. Well, Zapruder was a real aficionado at home movies. He'd been making home movies for some 30 years, especially of his kids and so forth. And so on the day of the assassination, he decided to go over to Dealey Plaza and film President and Mrs. Kennedy as they were coming down Elm Street in the motorcade. Kennedy, as many of you know, was on his way to give a speech at the Dallas Trade Mart. Well, lo and behold, when the assassination takes place, Zapruder's already filming. So he ends up filming the entire assassination. He doesn't drop the camera, he lowered it a bit, but he ends up capturing the entire assassination. And his film became known famously as the Zapruder film. So on the weekend of the assassination, he realizes he has something of value here. And he's the only one who has captured the entire assassination on film and the motorcade leading up to the assassination. So Life magazine, which was the most popular magazine of the time, it depended primarily on pictures to tell a story. I forget how many subscribers, but like 7 million or so, including Abraham and Lillian Zapruder, who held Life magazine in very high esteem, along with most other Americans. So they contact him, and they end up striking a deal in which they agree to pay him $150,000, and which is the equivalent of today, in today's dollars, of about $1.3 million. So his granddaughter decides that she's going to write a book on the family's experience with the film, the money it made, the effect it had on their lives. And so I thought, well, okay, this is kind of going to be an interesting account. So I started reading this book last summer, and wow, it bowled me over, because it was much more than that. Alexandra Zapruder, again, Abraham Zapruder's granddaughter, starts revealing some very personal matters that I don't think were known before she wrote them in this book. She discloses that there was a family taboo against discussing the Zapruder film. Now, mind you, she denies it was a taboo. She doesn't use that word. She says there wasn't an express prohibition. She says instead it was a code. That's the word she used, or a culture. She used that word too, within the family, that everyone understood meant that you don't discuss this film. You just could not bring it up. Well, that's precisely what a taboo is. It doesn't depend on a formal rule that you can't discuss it. It's just everyone understood. It develops as part of the culture in the family. Don't talk about this. Don't talk about this. Now, as I'm reading this, my eyes are bulging out, because I'm thinking, where is this going to lead? Because I happen to know that in most family taboos, there's a dark secret involved. That's how they develop. It's like, we can't talk about this secret. And so everybody kind of gets the message, don't talk about it, even though not everyone is privy to the secret. It's just the culture starts developing. We don't want to talk about this. We don't want to talk about this. When she was 11 years old, Alexandra relates a story of where she learned about the film. She knew it was famous, but she didn't feel comfortable asking her parents about it. That was how deeply ingrained this code or culture was in the family. And this is what she relates in her book. So she goes into her school library in really a secretive, furtive, clandestine endeavor, where she's trying to learn about the film. And so she reads the excerpt about it in William Manchester's book, The Death of a President. So when she was around 40 years old or so, long after her grandfather had died, he died in 1970, and long after her father had died, she decides, or a few years after her father had died, she decides she's going to write this book. And she says in her book that it was with a lot of trepidation that she embarked on this journey, and rightly so, because as she points out, I didn't know what I was going to discover in this. That's what she said. Well, what might I uncover? What if I discover something that I don't feel comfortable writing about? And she knew she was going against the entire family culture that had been in existence now, 50 years or so. But she says, I'm going to do it. That our family legacy depends on getting to the bottom of this. And so when she embarks on this journey, it's a very courageous journey, and I'm admiring her. As I'm reading the book, I say, wow, that takes a lot of courage, because she's bucking the entire family, and she's violating the taboo. So she decides that she's going to uncover the secret behind this taboo, and in the process, she's going to write a history of this film. Well, she comes up with two explanations for the taboo. She says, number one, that her grandfather was so deeply conflicted by the amount of money that he made, this consternation over it, because he was essentially, in his mind, making money off the assassination, this produce guilt feelings with him, and that this was one of the two factors that she ultimately concludes led to this taboo that you just can't discuss the film. Just don't discuss the film. And then the second one is she says that her grandfather was deeply, deeply traumatized and grief-stricken over having witnessed and filmed the assassination of President Kennedy, who he deeply admired. And that consternation, that trauma, that deep grief led to this family taboo. So you had these two reasons, guilt over the money and deep grief that supposedly lead to this taboo. Well, I'm reading this and I'm saying, oh, this is pure nonsense. Absolute pure nonsense. That if Abraham Zapruder was so guilt-ridden over the amount of money, he didn't have to ask for it. I mean, he was negotiating with Life magazine during the entire weekend, getting his film developed, getting affidavits signed, meeting with Life representative on Saturday, meeting with the media who were trying to bid on the film rights to the Zapruder film on Monday morning after the assassination. And then the way Life structured the payments, which is an important factor that I discuss in my book and explain the consequences of this decision. But Life magazine, through its publisher, a man named C.D. Jackson, instead of paying Zapruder the entire lump sum, $150,000 up front, they stretch it out in yearly installments of $25,000 each. And at the first two installments were done fairly quickly, so there were still several annual installments left. If Zapruder was so guilt-ridden over the amount of money that he was receiving, all he had to do was write Life magazine. He lived for another 7 years. All he had to do was write Life magazine and say, I'm waiving the amount of money that you still have to pay me. I just don't want it. I'm so guilt-ridden. I'm so stricken over having made money on this that I can't do it. He didn't do that. The money just kept coming in year after year. Now, with respect to the second factor, I mean, obviously, Abraham Zapruder was not so grief-stricken that he couldn't spend the entire weekend getting his film developed. He returns to his office, he puts it in his safe, which was a very wise, smart thing to do. Then the afternoon of the assassination, he goes to a television station, he does an interview, he then goes over to Kodak's local facilities to get his film developed. He goes to another place called the Jameson Film Company to get 3 copies made. He gets affidavits signed by everyone. He meets with the Life magazine representative on Saturday morning. He negotiates one of the sweetest deals a person could ever come up with, which was $50,000 for just the print rights, which in today's dollars was equivalent to about $330,000. And then on Monday morning, he's negotiating over the film rights, and he succeeds in getting that $50,000 tripled, where he ends up selling all the rights to the film to Life magazine for $150,000, or the equivalent of $1.3 million in today's dollars. So he clearly wasn't so grief-stricken that he couldn't do all these things. So I'm looking at this and saying, this is pure nonsense. That as much courage as Alexandra Zapruder showed in going after this dark secret, or the secret behind this taboo, she just failed. That she could not do it. So I made it my quest to figure out what this dark secret was. And of course, having a deep understanding of the Kennedy assassination enabled me to figure it out. And that's what I did. I spent the summer figuring out what this dark secret was. And so I said, I'm going to write a book that revolves around this dark secret. And so you'll notice as you start reading the book that it sets forth essentially the background that I'm setting forth now. But over the period of the book, that dark secret becomes very, very clear to anyone who reads the book. Now, but that's not all that the book is about. The book is about the assassination itself, because there's a direct relationship between the assassination and the Zapruder film. And as you start reading the book, you'll see what I mean by that. If you've read my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, you know that this autopsy that the military conducted on the weekend of the assassination on the very evening of the assassination, turned out to be a fraudulent autopsy. That's what's covered in my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, and even to a larger extent in the Kennedy Autopsy 2, or to a supplemental expanded extent. Well, as I develop in the book, there is a direct relationship between the fraudulent autopsy and the Zapruder film. And so I draw that connection. And so by the time a reader finishes reading the book, not only does he come up with the secret, the dark secret that underlay this family taboo, but also the larger context of how all this relates to the fraudulent autopsy that the military conducted. Those of you that are familiar with my work in this area know that, I keep saying there is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. None. No one's ever been able to come up with one, and no one ever will. That once you establish fraud in the autopsy, that's it. Because if there's one undisputed fact in this entire assassination saga, it is that it was the U.S. military establishment, the military intelligence establishment, that conducted that autopsy. Right? Not the Russians, not the Soviets, not the Cubans, not the mafia, not Israel. Nobody conducted that fraudulent autopsy except the military intelligence establishment. And so once you establish that the autopsy was fraudulent, which is what my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, was all about, that's it. Okay? Now, that book is based on a 5-volume book by Douglas Horne, who I previously mentioned, called Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. That is, in my belief, the second most important book in the Kennedy assassination genre of books. The first one being James Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable, which I highly recommend. That's a fairly easy read, but very, very profound read. And Horne's book is more difficult, but it is an absolute masterpiece. If there's anyone that has set forth the entire Kennedy assassination saga, it is Douglas Horne in this 5-volume book. And in fact, my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, was really just a synopsis of Horne's book. I figured, well, not everybody's going to buy a 5-volume book, so I'm going to do a synopsis of this 5-volume book. And I dedicated that book to Douglas Horne, and I've dedicated this book to Douglas Horne because I've never come across anyone who has a fiercer commitment to truth and accuracy than Douglas Horne. I mean, as I state in this book, it's almost an obsession with the guy, that he cannot tolerate anything that he thinks is a mistake. And I relate one story where in a conference that we had last spring, a year ago, on the JFK assassination, he had done like a 3-hour presentation. And he called me and says, I have to do it over. And I said, why? He says, well, because I've got a factual mistake in the middle of it. And I said, you don't have to do the whole, oh, yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. It's a mistake. And so, and he was insistent. He was going to do the whole three hours over again because he couldn't tolerate one, which I considered rather minor factual mistake, but not him. And so I finally prevailed on him, like, let's just put an addendum on at the very end of the presentation. That way it's a correction. Everybody will see it. And so he finally went along with that. Now, the reason I raise all this is because Alexandra Zapruder really goes after Horne in her book. And so, especially with one very, very overdriven attack on him relating to these affidavits that her grandfather had gotten on the weekend of the assassination. And I explain what that context is all about. I think it's also worth mentioning that that Abraham Zapruder died in 1970. And yet, now she was a baby when he died. But the taboo obviously extends beyond his death. Now, why would that be? If you accept her 2 explanations, this is one of the reasons why I'm sitting there as I'm reading the book saying, this is pure nonsense, that her grandfather was deeply grief-stricken and that he was suffering guilt over having received so much money. Well, okay, he dies. How does that extend into the life of her father and mother and the family? And Why does the taboo extend beyond a time after he dies? Makes no sense. And remember, when she's 11 years old, this is some 11 years after her grandfather died, the taboo is clearly in effect, because that's why she has to sneak into the school library to learn about the film. So that was another clue that I had. I said, no, there's much more going on here. Now, the most important question, though, is, and this is the question I get from people all the time, that, Jacob, what relevance does this have? Obviously, everybody involved in the assassination is dead. Alexander Zapruder's grandfather, Abraham, he's dead. This is a long time ago. Why do we spend time with it? Well, our mission here at FFF is to advance the case for liberty and limited government. And limited government is the exact opposite of what we have and have had since World War II. Our nation started out as a limited government republic. And I go into this in the book, and it's extremely important because it tells us where we are today as a nation. We started out as a limited government republic. That meant that the government's powers were extremely few and extremely limited. There was no big military force, intelligence force, no Pentagon, no military industrial complex, no CIA, no NSA, no FBI. This is for over 100 years. This was our founding system. It's called a limited government republic. That's what we believe in at FFF. It's what we've promoted during our entire 32-year history. Limited government, along with liberty and free markets and private property. Well, after World War II, that governmental system, which a lot of people don't realize, it was abandoned, rejected, in favor of a type of governmental system that is known as a national security state. It's an opposite type system. Under a national security state, the government's powers become omnipotent, totalitarian-like, even though it may still be a democracy where government officials and Congress and the president are being democratically elected. There is a section of the government that is now wielding dark side powers. That was the fundamental difference of these two governmental systems. Limited powers versus total omnipotent powers. Now, what am I talking about in terms of omnipotent powers? The power to assassinate. That once the government was converted to a national security state, it acquired the power to assassinate people without being held responsible. No murder trials for the assassins. Nobody prosecuted for murder. They have the omnipotent, non-reviewable power to assassinate people. And the federal courts made it very clear, we're not getting involved in this. Even though the Bill of Rights expressly says no person shall be deprived of life without due process of law, which is precisely what an assassination does. It deprives a person of life without due process. The federal courts deferred to this new way of life, national security state, indefinite detention, holding a person for the rest of his life in jail, torturing him without any kind of trial, no speedy trial, which is guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights was continually being enforced with respect to other matters like the drug war or, violating some kind of interstate law, criminal law. The Bill of Rights was still enforced, the speedy trial, right to counsel, and so forth. But with respect to over here in this area, of foreign affairs, assassinations, coups. There's another example of the power to initiate coups in foreign lands in order to effect regime change and get a foreign leader out of office, including through assassination. And that power was exercised. And right before Kennedy was sworn into office, the CIA orchestrated the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Congo. And the whole idea was that we need to fight godless communism. That after defeating the Nazis and Hitler, the U.S. officials told the American people that, look, you go ahead and feel good about this victory, but you cannot rest. We cannot rest. We're now facing a foe that is arguably even more dangerous and more deadly and destructive than Hitler and the Nazi regime. And that foe was godless communism that was represented principally by the Soviet Union, whose principal member was Russia. And so this huge anti-Russia, anti-Soviet, anti-China animus becomes immediately developed after World War II. And so the Americans are exhorted that, hey, we've got to be on our guard. The Reds are coming. The communists are coming. They get involved in Korea. They sacrifice, 30, 40,000 American men in this foreign civil war, but without a declaration of war by Congress. Here's another example of where the Constitution was thrown out the window once this conversion took place. And then, of course, later on, the Vietnam War, where they sacrificed really for nothing, as it turned out, some 58,000 people of my generation. Then you've got this whole Cold War that leads ultimately, during the Kennedy administration, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the nation within an inch of nuclear war, all-out nuclear war. It was that close. And then all the way up to where we are today, the war on terrorism, the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, and now the crisis in Ukraine, which is really getting us closer to the possibility, the danger of nuclear war than ever since, than at least the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, developing during this entire time is this very severe anti-Russia, anti-Soviet Union, anti-Red China animus. I mean, this is what's guiding the whole thing. And oh, by the way, I should mention that during this entire time, not only are the powers of the national security establishment expanding, powers of assassination, mass secret surveillance, coups, regime change operations, torture, indefinite detention. In other words, we were copying their system in order to fight their system, because the Soviet Union was a national security state too. So was Red China. So the argument was, we can't beat them with a limited government republic, which is nonsense. I consider this the biggest mistake in U.S. history. The biggest mistake. It really ended up destroying our own freedom. In the name of battling their unfree society, we lost our freedom. You don't fight communism with more communism. You fight it with freedom. And so during this entire time, there's this anti-Russia animus. Sound familiar? I mean, that's what's guiding us now. I mean, look what's going on today. I mean, if anybody expresses any even hint of questioning what's going on with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if they question the official narrative, the status supporters of the Pentagon, the CIA, their assets in the mainstream press, go on the attack immediately. Oh, you're a Putin lover. Oh, you're a Russia lover. Oh, you love terrorists, and all this stuff. Well, that's exactly what was going on during the Cold War. I mean, to be identified as a communist or a communist sympathizer, you were dead meat. I mean, they cost you your job. Remember the McCarthy hearings? I mean, this was the huge anti-Russia animus that was going on. Now, we all thought that the Cold War had ended, right? In 1989, 1991, the Soviet Union dismantles. They let Germany get united. They withdraw their troops out of Eastern Europe. They go back to Russia. And everybody thought, hey, okay, now we can have harmonious relations. But as it turns out, that's not what happened at all. Instead, the Pentagon and the CIA clearly went on the offensive. As we look back at it in retrospect, they used NATO, which was this old Cold War dinosaur, bureaucratic entity that should have gone out of existence, because that's what its purpose was to protect Western Europe from a supposed attack from the Soviet Union. Well, the Cold War was over. NATO should have been abolished, but instead they used NATO to begin absorbing, to move eastward toward Russia. So they start absorbing Eastern European countries, former Warsaw Pact countries, and they keep moving closer and closer to Russia's borders with nuclear missiles. And so clearly the Cold War never ended for the national security establishment. We see it also with the embargo on Cuba. That embargo is still in effect, that because of this Cold War mindset that they never could let go of. And then finally, and Russia kept telling them, Putin kept telling them, we're not going to let you have your nuclear missiles here on our borders, because that's what the ultimate would be when they absorbed Ukraine, that the U.S. could now install its nuclear missiles right on Russia's borders, pointing at Moscow, pointing at St. Petersburg, the whole nation of Russia. along with military bases, tanks, and so forth. Well, we know that the U.S. would never permit Russia or China or North Korea to do that in Cuba. I mean, that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about. You either take your missiles out of here or we're going to invade Cuba. Okay? Now, it's not legitimate. Cuba's an independent nation, just like Ukraine is. But we know as a practical matter that in all likelihood, the U.S. is going to prevent nuclear missiles from being installed in Cuba that are pointing at the United States. Even if they're not pointing at the United States, they're not going to let it happen. And that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about. Well, Russia kept telling the U.S. the same thing with Ukraine. And the Pentagon and the CIA said, tough luck. We're going to absorb Ukraine. That's our objective. And Russia said, if you do, I'm going to have to invade, just like you would have to invade Cuba to prevent this from happening. The U.S. said, we're willing to take that risk. And so they were. They were willing to risk, and so was Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, willing to risk thousands of lives of Ukrainians for the right to join NATO, which I consider a very corrupt thing to sacrifice people for. But we can see that how this Cold War mindset continued. It never went away. Well, but there's one rupture in all this, and that's John F. Kennedy. Now, he comes into office as a standard Cold Warrior, but by the time the Cuban Missile Crisis is over, he holds the CIA in disdain. I mean, he vowed to essentially abolish the CIA. He was removing his powers. This was after he had been double-crossed by the CIA, lied to at the Bay of Pigs, and I go into this in my book. And he had put his brother Bobby in charge of monitoring the CIA, who they loathed. I mean, they felt like they had this omnipotent power, and who's this neophyte president controlling us? And we're going to be here long after he's out of office. But Kennedy, it was a vicious war that was taking place early on. He fires Allen Dulles, the CIA director. Imagine, fires him. This guy was revered within the CIA. And then he fires the next two guys, his chief deputy and then another deputy. So Kennedy held the CIA in disdain. He's reputed to have said, I'm going to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces or something like words to that effect and scatter it to the winds. That's how vicious the war was. And they were furious at him. I mean, it was a mutual animosity between the CIA and Kennedy. They believed Kennedy was a traitor. Imagine, the CIA believes a president is a traitor and a coward for what happened during the Bay of Pigs. And I go into this in the book. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, now the Kennedy's holding the whole military establishment in disdain. And same thing with him. They called his resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis the biggest defeat in U.S. history. They compared his actions during the crisis to Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler. And then you've got, on the day of the assassination, an advertisement in the Dallas Morning News, one-page advertisement and a flyer. I go into this in the book also, accusing Kennedy of treason. I mean, the flyer has wanted for treason, and it's got Kennedy's picture there. And they go into that Kennedy was a commie lover. He was a Russia lover. He was a Khrushchev lover. Words to that effect. Not exactly those words, but essentially that was the message. The same thing we see today. People say, well, what's relevant? It's extremely relevant. Because why were they saying these things about Kennedy? Well, by the time the Cuban Missile Crisis is over, Kennedy has achieved a total breakthrough on the nature of the national security state. And he says, it goes to American University, and he throws down the gauntlet. He knew what he was doing. He was not a dumb man. He throws down the gauntlet, and he says, Cold War is over. He doesn't use those exact words, but he says, we're going to establish peaceful and friendly relations with Russia, the rest of the Soviet Union, China, the communist countries. On the very day he was assassinated, he had an emissary having lunch with Fidel Castro, secretly, but it certainly wasn't secret to the CIA, who was, by the way, at the same time meeting with a guy to conduct yet another assassination attempt without Kennedy's knowledge or consent. So this is the backdrop, and this is the significance, is that what Kennedy was doing was upending the apple cart. But in the process, he was at full-scale war with the national security establishment, not just over things like Vietnam, where he was pulling troops out, he had always only put advisors there, never combat troops, or the nuclear missile crisis, nuclear missile treaty, the test ban treaty that he entered into with the Soviets, or that he proposed a joint moon trip, a rocket ship trip to the moon, which of course would have meant sharing rocket technology with the communists. It had much more to do than any of those specific things. This was a man who was leading America in a new direction, one that did not involve an anti-Russia animus, an anti-China animus. Read his peace speech, remarkable speech. It's online. You can read it or you can listen to it. I'm not sure whether you can watch it or not, maybe, but it was broadcast all across the Soviet Union. Nothing like that had happened because the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was on the same wavelength. They were working together. They were having personal negotiations saying, let's put an end to this. Despite the fact, and Kennedy points this out in his peace speech, we have different ideologies. They're communists. We're capitalists. But that doesn't mean that we have to have this anti-Russia animus, this anti-Soviet animus, where we have to be pointing nuclear missiles at each other, where we have to be getting closer to their borders to put new nuclear missiles. They don't have to be doing it with us, but we can have a peaceful and harmonious relationship here that doesn't involve this constant crisis and chaos environment. And so the significance of this assassination, and this is why I keep emphasizing it, it provides the hope for how we get out of this morass. Provides the way for getting out of this morass, a deadly, dangerous, destructive morass, like nuclear war possibility morass, into which our nation has been plunged. That's the significance of the Kennedy assassination. That's why it's incumbent on every American to understand what was going on and what Kennedy's vision was for America. Because once he's assassinated, that vision is extinguished. Lyndon Johnson is elevated. He is on the same page as the national security establishment, and every president since then has bowed, deferred to this vision that the national security establishment has, that has at its core this constant anti-Soviet, anti-communist, anti-Russia, anti-China, anti-North Korea, anti-Cuba animus that leads us into this unhealthy, deadly, destructive, chaos, crisis-filled environment. So that's my show, Libertarian Angle, for this week. My book is entitled An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. I know I'm biased, but I consider this the best work I've done in the 32-year history. And I believe it's an important work because it provides the roadmap for what we need to do as a nation to get back on the right road, the road to liberty, free markets, private property, and limited government. Thanks so much for tuning in. I look forward to talking to you all next week.